Hello and welcome to This Week in the Garden. For today's episode, we're going to talk about weed control. And if you're like me, you've probably done a decent job controlling your weeds up until this point in the year. But we're getting into June, things are starting to heat up, and we're getting some rain, and these weeds are about to explode. So on today's episode, we're going to talk about things that you can do to make it a little bit easier on yourself this summer. Now, there's really two things that you can do to keep your garden weed free. You can do conventional gardening, or you can do gardening where you're spraying herbicides. So for conventional, the kind of control methods that you have, you can weed by hand, which everybody is going to end up doing at some time. You can do mechanical with things like hose or tillers, that kind of thing. Or you can put down cover over top of your plants. And I've done a little bit of each of these in my garden, so I'll talk about those and what I've done in my garden at a later time. Now, if you want to be spraying herbicides, there's really two different types of herbicides you can spray. You can put down pre-emergence, which when you put them down, they prevent your plants from germinating, so the weed seeds won't be able to emerge. You can also spray post-emergence, which are things like Roundup and other herbicides that kill the weeds as they've come up. And so these need to be used in combination to keep your garden weed free. And I've used some of these as well. So we'll talk about kind of my approach with a conventional as well as with spraying herbicides. Now, when we talk about conventional methods to keep your garden weed free, we'll talk about things like weeding by hand, and that's something that everybody's going to have to do because inevitably those weeds are going to grow up right beside your plants and you're not going to be able to till right there. So this is something that you're going to have to do. I do it all the time, but we're hopefully going to limit that to keeping it just near the base of those plants. Other things that you can do are tilling. That works great in the alleyways. So alleys need to be kept relatively weed free, and that's because they're an area where diseases and insects can survive and they can spread to your plants. So you want to keep those weeds down, but also allow the weeds to spread into your rows. So you want to keep those weeds relatively small and weed free in your alleyways. The last way, which kind of goes with those, is with a hoe. You can use a hoe, especially on bare ground like out here in the corn, and you can do it in your alleys. You can do it beside the plants if you're careful. Now, normally hoes will kind of dig up the plants. Sometimes they'll scrape them off, so I don't really like to use a hoe, but there's a type of hoe called a stirrup hoe that works, or a scuffle hoe. It's really the same hoe, just different names for the same tool. And that works because it kind of digs up underneath the plant and removes the roots as well. So they work a little bit better than your average gardening hoe. The one thing I will say when you're going to use a hoe is make sure that it's dry outside. If it's not dry outside, then you're going to remove those roots and the plants are going to be able to just take root wherever they're at because the soil's moist. So you want to make sure that it's dry outside. And then the last thing that you can do is put a covering over your plants. And I used hay, but you can use straw as well. I like to use those over something like mulch or plastic because it's going to degrade over time. It can mix right into your soil and you'll be able to plant right there next year. If you're putting down mulch, it might take a longer time, especially if you're using wood chips or something like that. So straw works really well. You want to put down between 2 to 4 inches around your plants. When your plants are transplants, you want to allow a little bit of room around those plants. That way it doesn't get too hot there. It doesn't kind of choke out those plants. And then you can add more over time. If you have plants that you're planting from seed, what I do is I just leave a little hole where I've planted that seed so it can come up, and then I fill in once the plant matures. But those are conventional ways that you can help to keep your garden weed free. Now, if you're putting down herbicides, there's really pre-emergence and post-emergence. I put down pre-emergence anytime that I have transplants. And the reason is the plants have already emerged, so pre-emergent isn't going to hurt your vegetables. And so I put those in beds like tomatoes and my cucumbers and things like that I'm not planting from seed. I put down a post-emergent anytime before I till up my garden. And if you till up a garden before that you spray a post-emergent, you'll end up having weeds that get buried and they're already established before your seeds come up. So I spray a post-emergent, something like Roundup, before I plant, wait about a week, and then till up the garden, and then plant my vegetables. Now, what's worked really well for me when I'm planting things from seed, whether that's beans or squash, things like that, is I'll spray the post-emergent, whether it's Roundup or some herbicide like that, and then I'll till up the garden. I go and I plant my seeds. I cover those up with hay and leave a small opening. That prevents any weeds from growing that were from seed in all of the areas except for that hole around the plant. Then once those plants have emerged and I know that they're going to survive, and usually I wait about 2 weeks after those plants have emerged to make sure that they're going to be vigorous. Then I'll put down a pre-emergent. Something like preen works well. Just make sure that it's labeled for a vegetable garden. But I put down a pre-emergent and then I put down more straw, and that pretty much keeps my garden weed free. All I have to do is come back and pick weeds by hand and then till the alleys. So that's weed control. There's a lot of different methods that you can do to keep your garden weed free. If you have any suggestions or any comments, we've got a form you can fill out on our website and on our articles. So please do that, and we'll take a look at those, and we'll add any of your comments at the end of these videos for next week. Also, take a look at our special edition from this week. We'll allow you to vote on next week's topic, so make sure that you do that before Monday, so I have an idea of what footage to shoot for next week's video. But with that, that's all we have from today's episode of This Week in the Garden.